A week earlier, he had led tens of millions of people. Now he was handed one passport, valid in one direction, and 1,000 pounds, and told to leave his country forever. That was the entire severance for the head of a family that had ruled 3 continents for 600 years. He boarded a quiet train at a small station, chosen so no crowd would see him go. But the passport and the 1,000 pounds were not the strangest thing this family lost. The real fortune, worth enough to reshape a region, is where this story turns. The man on that platform was the last caliph, and the only person who bowed to him as he left was the Jewish station master, who understood what he was watching. To understand how it came to a train at a hidden station, you have to understand the family being put on it. The House of Osman began around the year 1299 with a warrior chief in a corner of Anatolia. Over the centuries that followed, it grew into one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. 36 rulers in a single, unbroken line. At its height, the empire stretched from the gates of Central Europe to the deserts of Arabia, from the shores of North Africa to the mountains of the Caucasus. The head of the family did not only rule land, he held the title of caliph, which meant that in name, he was the leader of the entire Sunni Muslim world. Palaces lined the water, armies made kings in the West nervous. It looked for a very long time like something that would simply always exist. But by the middle of the 1800s, the empire had earned a cruel nickname among the diplomats of Europe. They called it the sick man of the continent. Territory fell away year after year. There were reforms and there were strong rulers who tried to hold the whole thing together, and none of it was enough. Then came the First Great War, and the empire gambled on the losing side and lost. Foreign soldiers walked the streets of the capital, and out of the wreckage rose a soldier named Mustafa Kemal, who would later be called Ataturk, and who had no intention of saving the monarchy. He meant to replace it entirely. In November of 1922, the assembly he led abolished the sultanate. The last sultan, Mehmed VI, slipped out of the country on a British warship, looking back at a city his ancestors had held for 469 years. He would never see it again. For a short while, one piece of the old order survived. A cousin, a quiet and cultured man named Abdülhamid II, was allowed to keep the title of caliph. He was a painter and a musician who spoke several languages. He held no power at all. He was a symbol and nothing more. And even that was too much for the new republic to tolerate. So we come back to the train. On the 3rd of March in 1924, the assembly passed a single piece of legislation known as Law Number 431. Read the plain text of it, and you see how total it was. It abolished the caliphate. It stripped every member of the House of Osman of their citizenship. It ordered them out of the country, and it forbade them from ever setting foot on Turkish soil again, even to pass through on a train to somewhere else. And it seized their property. One law and an entire dynasty was erased from the nation it had built. The numbers tell you how wide the net was cast. 156 people were named directly in the order, but once you add the family members who followed them out, the servants who refused to leave their masters, and the children who had no say at all, the true number of exiles ran into the hundreds. The caliph himself was not given the few days the law technically allowed. He was rushed out within a single day, which is why his train left from that small station instead of the main terminal. Officials were afraid of what a crowd might do if they saw him go. Now here is the part that the usual retelling races passed, and it is the part that matters most. What actually happened to the money? Because a family that had ruled for 6 centuries should, by any reasonable expectation, have left in comfort. They did not. When they were deported, each household was handed the same thing the caliph received: a passport valid for one direction only, and 1,000 pounds. For people accustomed to giving money away to charity by the sackful, that sum covered travel and perhaps a single month of ordinary living. They had no fortunes waiting in foreign banks. The wealth people imagined they were sitting on did not exist in the way outsiders assumed. They were given 1 year to sell whatever property they still held inside the country. 1 year under police supervision in a market that knew exactly how desperate they were. So they sold. They sold jewels for a fraction of their worth. Because the buyers understood that the sellers had no time and no leverage. They sold heirlooms that had passed through the family for generations. Lightweight, valuable things that could be carried out and turned quickly into cash. And here's the detail that makes the whole thing ache. Most of them did not even pack properly. They left clothes in wardrobes and paintings on walls because they were certain, absolutely certain, that the public still loved them and that this madness would blow over in a few months and they would be called home. It did not blow over. For the women of the family, the exile would last 28 years. For the men, it would last 50. And the estates they trusted to others to sell on their behalf. Those were, in many cases, simply taken. Assets handed to people the family believed they could rely on vanished into private pockets. The palaces they left behind were picked over, some of them ransacked under the eyes of the very police meant to be guarding them. The family scattered. They wanted to go to Egypt, which had once been Ottoman ground, but the British who ruled there would not have them, and neither would the Egyptian king, who had no wish to host his former overlords. They tried for Syria, close to home, and the new republic blocked it. So some settled in Beirut under French rule, and the rest spread out across Europe, mostly to the south of France, where the little town of Nice became an unofficial capital for a dynasty with no country. Their travel documents expired after a single year. By 1925, most of the family were effectively stateless, unable to legally cross a border, trapped wherever they happened to have landed. It took the direct effort of one prince, appealing to the French government to secure courtesy passports so that people could move at all. The French gave them papers, but never citizenship. And there is a bitter irony buried in that refusal because centuries earlier, an Ottoman sultan had rescued a French king from captivity, and now that same nation would not grant the sultan's descendants a home. The jewels sold cheap and the estates lost to trustees were only the surface of the money story. Underneath sat a fortune that was real and enormous, and that the family spent decades trying and failing to recover. The grandfather of much of this generation was Sultan Abdülhamid II, and Abdülhamid had been careful. Long before the fall, he had quietly bought land and assets and registered them as his own private property, separate from the state treasury. Among those holdings were oil fields around Mosul in what is now Iraq, and vast stretches of land in Palestine, some accounts putting it at around 4,000 square kilometers. Historians studying the claims later estimated the private estate, the oil included, at something on the order of 100 million pounds sterling. In the money of that era, that was a staggering sum. When the empire fell, that private wealth did not quietly pass to his heirs. His sons and daughters, led by his eldest son and one of his daughters, launched what one study called one of the most spectacular lawsuits ever attempted. For roughly 28 years, they approached one government after another across the Middle East and Europe, trying to reclaim the land and the oil that had been their father's personal property. And they kept losing. The reason they lost is the quiet scandal at the center of this whole story. The land sat in territory now controlled by Britain. And the British had no intention of letting a court rule that a deposed Muslim dynasty still owned the ground under the Mosul oil basin, because that ruling would have set a precedent that threatened their grip on the oil and on Palestine both. So the claim was blocked, handed down to local courts, tangled up, and finally exhausted. The family that had been handed 1,000 pounds at the border was, on paper, owed a fortune large enough to reshape a region. They never saw a penny of it. Meanwhile, the people themselves had to survive, and this is where the scale of the fall becomes almost unbearable to picture. These were individuals raised in palaces, tutored in poetry and calligraphy and music and imperial protocol, princes trained for military command that no foreign country would ever let them use. Some sold the last of their jewelry and then had nothing. There are documented accounts of members of this family washing dishes in hotel kitchens, of princes and princesses reduced to manual labor, of some begging in the street, and of a few searching through trash for something to eat. A handful lived on aid quietly given by Ottoman Armenians who had also fled to Europe. And some, the records say plainly, died of hunger. Ministers and scholars and officers of a world empire were reduced, in the words of the historian who wrote the definitive book on their exile, to begging. The training that had prepared them for a throne, prepared them for nothing that exile actually demanded. There is one small story inside the larger one that stays with you. Among the exiles was a prince who was a genuinely gifted pianist, a virtuoso by all accounts. But he was so painfully shy that he could never bring himself to perform for an audience. He would only play his piano from behind a curtain, hidden, so that no one could see him. His talent was real, and his refinement was real, and there was no place left in the world for either one, because the world that had valued those things was gone. The betrayals did not help. The very trustee appointed to sell the family's remaining property inside the country and forward them, the proceeds simply kept the money. The people the family had trusted most became, for many of them, the ones who took the last of what they had. And a few exiles wandered into stranger fates entirely. Some began publishing newspapers, attacking the new republic from neighboring Greece, until the government in the new capital pressured the authorities there to shut them down. One prince's father threw himself into a failed uprising of ethnic Uyghurs in western China, an adventure that drew the attention of both the Soviet Union and the United States, and it ended with him found dead in a New York hotel room in 1935 under circumstances no one ever fully explained. The scattered dynasty, stateless and poor, kept getting pulled into the currents of a century that no longer had any use for emperors. The caliph himself, the man on the train, ended up in Nice and later in Paris. He kept painting, he kept playing music, he attended prayers, wrote his memoirs across many volumes, and held on to a strange dignity as a Western gentleman who still wore the traditional cap of his lost court. He died in Paris in 1944, as the city was being fought over in another war, and his family's wish to bury him in the old imperial capital was refused by the Turkish government. His body waited in a Paris mosque for nearly a decade before he was finally laid to rest in Medina, in the desert where the very institution he had lost, the caliphate, had been born 13 centuries earlier. He never went home, not even in death. Now let me introduce you to the two people who carried this story into living memory, because their lives show you both ends of what exile did to this family. The first was born in a palace in early 1921. Her name was Nesliha Sultan, and when she was born, cannons were fired across the empire to announce her arrival, and her name was recorded in the official palace register. She was, it turned out, the very last member of the dynasty whose birth would ever be greeted by an imperial gun salute. She was the granddaughter of the last sultan on one side and the last caliph on the other, which made her about as close to the old imperial center as a person could be. She was 3 years old when the family was thrown out. She grew up in Nice in the years of financial struggle, and then, in a cruel repetition of history, she married an Egyptian prince, and when Egypt's own monarchy was overthrown in the 1950s, she was forced into exile a second time. 2 dynasties fell inside one woman's lifetime. She lived to 91, and she died in the old imperial city in 2012, the oldest surviving member of the House of Osman, the last person alive who had been written into that palace register. The second is the one who best captures the strangeness of it all. His name was Sultan Osman, and he was a grandson of Sultan Abdülhamid II. Under the old rules, he would in time have become the Sultan. Instead, he moved to New York, and for more than 60 years, he lived in a modest, rent-controlled apartment, a 2-bedroom unit up a narrow, dim staircase in a small building on the east side of the city. The man who might have ruled from a palace of nearly 300 rooms lived in a walk-up flat and for a while kept a small crowd of dogs that neighborhood children helped him walk. He ran a mining business. He refused for most of his life to carry any nation's passport on the grounds that he considered himself a citizen of an empire that no longer existed, and he traveled instead on a certificate his lawyer devised. That worked until the security rules tightened after the attacks in 2001. And only then, at last, did he accept a Turkish passport in 2004. When he finally visited the palace his grandfather had lived in, he insisted on joining an ordinary tour group in the summer heat because he did not want a fuss. He died in 2009 at 97, and he was buried in the old capital near the sultan he descended from. So what happened to the rest of them, and when did the punishment finally end? It ended in 2 uneven halves. In 1952, 28 years after the expulsion, the Republic at last allowed the women of the dynasty to come home. The men were made to wait far longer. It was not until 1974, a full half-century after that train pulled away, that the male descendants were permitted to return. By then, most of the original exiles were dead. The men who came back were largely sons and grandsons born in foreign cities, in Nice and Beirut and Paris, coming home to a country that had spent 50 years teaching its school children to see the Ottoman past as something to move beyond. For many of them, it was not really a homecoming at all. It was arriving as a stranger in the place their grandparents had ruled. Their palaces were museums now. Their name, once forbidden, had become a curiosity. They took the surname Osmanoglu, meaning son of Osman, and they rejoined an ordinary nation as ordinary citizens with an extraordinary past. The family still exists. The title of head of the house passes to the eldest living male, and it has changed hands several times as the exile generation has died off. One recent head, Dundar, had been born in exile in the Syrian city of Damascus, and he lived his entire life there and died there in 2021, in his 90s, never having managed to settle in the homeland of his ancestors. War and broken relations between the two countries made it impossible to bring the frail old prince home. After him, the title passed to his brother, Harun Osman, born in 1932, who did return to the old capital in the 1970s and lives there still as the current head of a house that once ruled an empire. He has children and grandchildren. The line continues quietly in a republic built on the ruins of everything his family lost. And that is the thread that ties this whole story together. And it is why the money matters more than the palaces. Most royal falls are about losing power. This one was about erasure that went right down to the bank account. Other dynasties that fell got to keep something. Some kept their palaces, some kept a share of their wealth, some kept at least the right to walk the streets of their old capital. The House of Osman was stripped of the throne, the name, the citizenship, and the home all at once, handed a one-way passport and a month's living, made to sell their jewels to strangers who knew they were desperate. And then, across 28 years of courtrooms they were not even allowed to attend, they were denied the enormous private fortune that was genuinely theirs. And here's the thing about this family that no other fallen dynasty can quite claim. The ones who were handed £1,000 and told to disappear did not disappear. Their descendants are alive today, living ordinary lives on 3 continents, still carrying the name of the warrior chief who started it all more than 7 centuries ago. If stories like this one are what you come here for, the buried money and the true cost of a crown after it falls, then subscribe and stay with the channel, because there are a lot more thrones and a lot more lost fortunes still waiting to be traced.